They built monuments to the Queen, but the galaxy almost forgot the man who made her future possible. The first warning came without sound. Every tactical display aboard the human cruiser went dark for exactly one heartbeat before returning in a cascade of crimson alerts. Captain Ethan Carter looked through the reinforced bridge canopy as countless streaks of pale blue plasma carved silent scars across the blackness of space. Beyond the flashes drifted the shattered remains of escort vessels that only minutes earlier had formed a perfect defensive wall around the royal convoy of the Valar Empire. Nobody on the bridge panicked. They had trained too long for that. Calm voices filled the air while navigation officers rerouted power, engineers stabilized damaged systems, and communications specialists searched desperately for a signal that still made sense inside the growing storm of electronic interference. Ethan tightened one gloved hand around the command rail and studied the tactical map. Every route toward safety had already begun to collapse. The enemy had predicted the convoy's movements with frightening precision. Their formation was not random. It was a trap waiting to close. "Status?" Ethan asked quietly. His executive officer swallowed before answering. 3 escort ships have fallen back. 2 more have lost propulsion. The royal carrier is exposed. Ethan nodded once. He had escorted diplomats before, scientists before, even planetary governors. But this mission carried a burden unlike any other. Hidden inside the elegant silver flagship was Princess Lysera Vale, the youngest heir to an empire that stretched across dozens of star systems. Intelligence reports described her as brilliant, disciplined, and unexpectedly devoted to peace despite being raised during generations of conflict. Ethan had never spoken to her. He had only caught a distant glimpse of her boarding the convoy days earlier beneath polished banners that shimmered like moonlight. To him, she was simply another life under his protection, no more valuable than the newest mechanics serving below deck. The cruiser lurched as another wave of distant impacts rippled through nearby space. Loose tools rattled against metal flooring. Emergency lights painted every face in deep crimson. Somewhere below the bridge, a damaged coolant system released a low mechanical hiss that echoed through the ship like a slow breath. "Captain," the sensor officer said, "they are ignoring us. Every attack vector is converging on the royal carrier." Ethan understood immediately. The enemy did not need to destroy the fleet. They only needed one target. Outside the canopy, the royal vessel emerged between drifting fragments of armor plating, its graceful hull reflecting bursts of blue light as automated defense systems struggled to intercept incoming fire. Even at this distance, it looked strangely fragile against the endless darkness. Ethan remembered something his father had once told him before his first deployment. Courage was rarely loud. Most of the time, it looked exactly like doing your job, while everyone else searched for someone to blame. He drew a slow breath and turned toward the helm. "Bring us between the carrier and the incoming line." Several officers looked up at once. Nobody argued. They knew exactly what that command meant. The human cruiser accelerated, engines glowing brighter with every passing second as it abandoned the relative safety of formation. Warning alarms multiplied across every display. The distance closed rapidly. Through the widening field of view, Ethan caught his first clear sight of Princess Lysera standing behind the transparent observation wall of the royal carrier. Even separated by vacuum and layers of reinforced crystal, her calm posture stood in sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding both ships. For a single impossible moment, their eyes appeared to meet across the darkness between 2 worlds. Then the tactical computer announced a single incoming plasma trajectory that every officer immediately understood could not be intercepted in time. Every calculation on the bridge reached the same conclusion before any human voice dared to say it aloud. The incoming plasma wave would arrive in less than 4 seconds. It carried too much energy for the damaged defense grid to absorb, and the royal carrier no longer possessed enough maneuvering power to evade its path. Ethan Carter stared at the glowing trajectory stretching across the tactical display like a line already written into history. His executive officer spoke carefully, almost hoping the captain would disagree with the computer. "There is no successful interception pattern remaining." Ethan never looked away from the viewport. "There is one." His hand moved across the command console with steady precision. Thrusters along the cruiser ignited in perfect sequence, pushing thousands of tons of reinforced alloy directly across the path between the royal carrier and the approaching blast. Every alarm aboard the ship shifted into a higher warning tone. Structural stress climbed beyond recommended limits. Reactor output surged as the engines demanded everything the vessel could still provide. Crew members exchanged silent glances before returning to their stations. They had served under Ethan long enough to recognize the expression on his face. He had already made his decision. No speech would change it. Across the narrow stretch of space, Princess Lysera watched the human cruiser alter course with impossible determination. Her advisors crowded around the command platform, issuing rapid instructions in the elegant Velar language, while technicians struggled to restore shield integrity. One elderly counselor stepped toward her. "Your Highness, we must prepare emergency evacuation procedures." She barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on the dark, gray human vessel, now placing itself between danger and the royal flagship. It was not retreating. It was not searching for escape. It was choosing to stand still where every survival instinct demanded movement. "Why are they doing that?" she whispered. None of her officers answered. They already understood. The distance between both ships disappeared with terrifying speed. Ethan activated the external communications channel. Static filled the speakers before a clear connection finally emerged. The image of the Royal Command deck flickered across a damaged monitor. For the first time, he saw Princess Lysera clearly. She looked younger than he had expected, composed despite the flashing emergency lights surrounding her. She carried herself with quiet discipline instead of fear. Their conversation lasted only seconds. "Human captain," she said softly, "move your ship. You still have time." Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile. "Not enough time for both of us." She stepped closer to the screen. "I cannot order you to sacrifice your crew." "You are not," Ethan replied. "My crew knows exactly who they are." Around him, nobody protested. The navigator secured his restraints. The communications officer quietly removed a family photograph from beside her console and slipped it into her uniform pocket. An engineer closed his eyes for one brief moment before reopening them with calm acceptance. Each person continued performing their duties with practiced focus. Fear remained present, but it never became louder than responsibility. Outside, the brilliant stream of plasma reflected across the armored hull, bathing both ships in waves of blue and white light. Ethan reached toward the master control panel and redirected every remaining unit of shield energy to the forward array. The bridge dimmed as power disappeared from every non-essential system. Heating, artificial lighting, and secondary navigation shut down one after another until only the tactical displays continued glowing inside the growing darkness. Princess Lysera watched the human cruiser become a solitary wall between her people and certain disaster. She wanted to speak again, to offer gratitude or promise that his courage would never be forgotten, yet no words felt large enough for what she was witnessing. Ethan looked forward one final time, not at the incoming light, but at the silent stars beyond it. They had always reminded him how small one person truly was. Perhaps that was why every choice mattered. The bridge disappeared beneath an overwhelming white glow as the last shield indicator reached its limit, and then every transmission from Captain Ethan Carter's cruiser vanished from the tactical network all at once. Silence arrived before anyone realized the battle had ended. The brilliant light faded from the tactical displays, leaving only drifting fragments illuminated by distant stars that suddenly seemed impossibly calm. Across the command deck of the royal carrier, every officer stared at the empty section of space where the human cruiser had stood only moments earlier. Sensor specialists searched desperately through expanding clouds of ionized particles. Long-range scanners swept the battlefield again and again, hoping to find the familiar transponder signal of Captain Ethan Carter's ship. Each attempt returned the same answer. No confirmed life signs. No active engines. No emergency beacon. Only scattered echoes disappearing into the endless darkness. Princess Lysera remained motionless before the observation window. Reflected in the transparent crystal, emergency lights painted faint blue lines across her face, but her expression never changed. She simply continued looking toward the place where a stranger had chosen another person's future over his own. Around her, commanders slowly began restoring order. Rescue vessels departed to recover survivors. Damaged escorts regrouped around the carrier. Medical teams moved quietly through crowded corridors, treating exhaustion more often than injury. The crisis had passed, yet nobody celebrated. Victory carried an unfamiliar weight whenever its cost had been paid by someone who expected nothing in return. Hours later, inside the royal council chamber, the atmosphere remained unusually subdued. The polished circular table reflected soft white light, while senior ministers debated military reports, diplomatic consequences, and casualty estimates. Names filled the official records one after another. Ships lost, equipment destroyed, personnel missing. Then the chief archivist reached a final entry. Human cruiser Resolute. Commanding officer, Captain Ethan Carter. Status, presumed lost while defending the royal carrier. No one spoke for several long seconds. At last, one elderly counselor lowered his head. Without that intervention, this chamber would now be discussing succession instead of reconstruction. Lysera quietly closed the report before her, then let history record the truth. Every eye turned toward the young princess. His decision protected far more than my life. It preserved every chance our worlds still have to choose peace. The council unanimously approved a formal declaration of gratitude to the human alliance. Memorials were commissioned. Official speeches were delivered. Diplomats praised cooperation between civilizations. Yet none of those carefully chosen words ever felt equal to what had actually happened in the darkness beyond the convoy. Days became months. Months slowly became years. The war that had consumed entire sectors gradually lost its momentum. Treaties replaced emergency broadcasts. Trade routes reopened where battle formations had once drifted. New generations grew up knowing the conflict only through museums and classroom recordings. Throughout those changing years, one tradition quietly endured inside the Veltraxis Palace. Every morning before beginning affairs of state, Princess Lysera walked alone into a circular memorial hall overlooking the eastern horizon of her homeworld. At its center stood a simple statue carved from pale crystal instead of precious metals. It did not depict a conqueror raising a weapon or a ruler wearing ceremonial robes. It showed an ordinary human officer standing with empty hands, facing forward as though still protecting someone beyond the horizon. No grand title appeared beneath the sculpture. Only one line had been engraved into the polished stone. He chose another life before his own. Palace staff often noticed the princess standing there in complete silence, sometimes for only a minute, sometimes much longer. She never explained why. She never needed to. On the 12th anniversary of the convoy attack, dawn spread gentle gold across the palace towers as bells echoed through the capital. Thousands gathered below to witness a ceremony unlike any in generations. Noble families, military commanders, scholars, and ordinary citizens filled the great avenue leading toward the ancient throne hall. The empire had come to welcome a new sovereign. As attendants carefully placed the royal crown upon Lysera's head, cheers rolled across the city like distant thunder. She accepted the weight of the crown with steady grace. Yet even in that historic moment, her eyes drifted almost instinctively toward the eastern sky, where somewhere beyond countless stars, a promise she had never abandoned still waited quietly to be answered. The first sensation was not pain. It was cold. A deep mechanical cold that seemed to reach through every muscle before slowly retreating inch by inch. Captain Ethan Carter opened his eyes against a ceiling of pale white light that shimmered behind a layer of frost. His heartbeat sounded unusually loud inside the silent chamber surrounding him. Then came the unfamiliar rhythm of machines awakening one after another. Soft tones echoed through the room. Hydraulic locks released with careful precision. Warm air flowed across his face as transparent panels slid upward, carrying clouds of frozen vapor toward the ceiling. Ethan blinked several times, trying to understand why every movement felt strangely heavy. The last thing he remembered was standing on the bridge of the Resolute, watching a wall of brilliant plasma racing toward his ship. He remembered gripping the command rail. He remembered seeing Princess Lysera through the observation window of the royal carrier. After that, only light. A calm synthetic voice finally broke the silence. Cryogenic preservation sequence complete. Biological recovery exceeds expected projections. Welcome back. Ethan slowly pushed himself upright. His uniform had been replaced by a simple medical garment. but the familiar silver identification tag still rested against his chest. He reached for it almost instinctively, letting his fingers trace the engraved letters of his name, as though confirming he still belonged to the same life he remembered. Around him stretched a compact medical bay unlike any he had ever seen. The equipment looked more refined than the systems aboard modern Human Alliance vessels. Displays floated freely above polished consoles without visible projectors. Diagnostic drones drifted silently through the air, scanning his condition before disappearing into recessed compartments along the walls. Nothing felt familiar. Even the lighting carried a softer tone than the harsh illumination common aboard military ships. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the recovery platform and stood carefully. His balance returned faster than expected, although every joint protested with quiet stiffness. A nearby console activated as soon as he approached. A single message appeared across its surface. Emergency Recovery Facility 7. Autonomous operations active. No permanent personnel present. Ethan frowned. Facility 7, he whispered. His own voice sounded rough from years of silence. He searched the room until he found a wall chronometer displaying the current galactic standard date. At first he assumed the numbers had malfunctioned. He checked them again, then once more. His breathing slowed. 12 years. 12 complete years had passed since the convoy mission. That cannot be right. He quickly accessed another terminal, hoping for confirmation of a technical error. Instead, he found archived maintenance records documenting uninterrupted automated operation over more than a decade. A damaged escape capsule had entered the station's emergency capture field shortly after the convoy battle. The capsule contained one critically injured human officer placed into experimental long-duration cryogenic stabilization because no rescue vessel could arrive before biological failure. Every repair cycle had been performed by machines. Every year of survival had depended on silent algorithms patiently refusing to let one heartbeat disappear. Ethan stared through a nearby observation window. Outside floated a lonely asteroid wrapped in steel docking rings and communication arrays. Beyond it stretched a peaceful sector filled with civilian shipping lanes instead of military patrols. Large cargo freighters moved steadily between distant jump gates. Passenger liners crossed the darkness beneath bright navigation beacons. There were no warning sirens, no drifting debris, no battle formations. The war was gone. A faint chime echoed through the station as a communications antenna finally aligned with the modern galactic network. Archived headlines flooded the central display faster than Ethan could read them. Historic peace accord signed. Reconstruction complete. Expansion initiative begins. Queen Lysera Vale addresses the Galactic Assembly. Ethan paused at the final headline. Beneath it appeared an official portrait of a confident ruler wearing an elegant silver crown. He recognized her immediately despite the passing years. The young princess standing behind reinforced crystal had become the woman leading an empire. Ethan remained completely still, unable to decide which realization felt more impossible. The galaxy had continued without him, and somewhere among billions of lives, the person he had tried to protect had fulfilled the future he believed he would never live to see. The shuttle touched down with barely a whisper, settling onto the polished landing platform of Meridian Station as if it had performed the journey 1,000 times before. Ethan Carter remained seated for a few extra seconds after the engines powered down. Through the oval window, he watched travelers move calmly across wide glass corridors beneath bright artificial skies. Families laughed while children chased floating guide drones. Merchants greeted customers from open storefronts filled with colors from worlds Ethan had never visited. A musician played a gentle melody beside a fountain where water flowed through suspended rings instead of falling straight downward. It looked less like a transportation hub and more like a promise that the galaxy had finally remembered how to breathe. He stepped onto the platform carrying only a small military duffel and the identification tag that had remained around his neck through 12 silent years. Nobody stared at him because of his uniform. They stared because they recognized the name printed on the faded shoulder patch. At first, Ethan assumed they were simply curious about an old military design no longer in service. Then a teenage boy pointed toward him while whispering excitedly to his parents. A middle-aged cargo pilot removed his cap without saying a word. An elderly alien woman with pale lavender skin gently pressed one hand against her chest before offering him a respectful bow. Ethan looked behind himself, wondering whether someone important had entered the terminal after him. Nobody had. The gestures were meant for him. Confused, he continued walking until he reached a public information display stretching nearly 30 feet across the central atrium. The enormous screen cycled through historical documentaries celebrating the anniversary of the Galactic Peace Accord. One image stopped him in place. It showed a familiar gray cruiser positioned before an expanding wave of blue light. Beneath the image appeared a title, The Stand of Captain Ethan Carter. He stared without moving as the documentary narrator spoke in a calm, measured voice. Historians widely recognize Captain Carter's decision as the defining moment that preserved the Veltraxis royal line and prevented the collapse of Allied negotiations. His sacrifice became an enduring symbol that courage is measured not by survival, but by the willingness to protect another life. Ethan frowned slightly. "Sacrifice?" he murmured. "I was only doing my job." The woman operating a nearby coffee stand overheard him. She looked at him carefully before her eyes widened. "You sound exactly like him." Ethan offered a polite smile. "Like who?" She laughed softly. "Captain Ethan Carter." For a brief moment, he considered telling her the truth. Instead, he accepted the steaming paper cup she quietly slid across the counter. When he reached for his wallet, she gently shook her head. "No charge. I appreciate it, but I can pay. My grandfather survived that convoy because your cruiser stayed where everyone else would have turned away." Her voice remained warm rather than dramatic. "He always said heroes never understand why people remember them." Ethan lowered his hand. He accepted the coffee with quiet gratitude, uncertain how to respond to a story that felt as though it belonged to someone else. Continuing through the station, he noticed more reminders waiting around every corner. A children's classroom displayed a mural inspired by the convoy rescue. A bookstore window featured biographies of famous leaders, and among the queens, diplomats, and explorers stood a single weathered human officer in a simple black uniform. Even a transit platform carried a bronze plaque engraved with words he had spoken moments before placing his ship between danger and the royal carrier. "Not enough time for both of us." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He barely remembered saying the sentence. To him it had been nothing more than an honest observation. Somehow those ordinary words had outlived an entire war. As evening light filtered through the station's transparent ceiling, a discreet notification appeared across the public information network. By order of Her Majesty Queen Lysra Vale, all available diplomatic channels were requested to verify an extraordinary report concerning the possible survival of Captain Ethan Carter. Ethan stared silently at the announcement while, somewhere far beyond the stars above Meridian Station, a queen who had never stopped believing finally received the answer she had waited 12 years to hear. The royal shuttle descended through layers of silver clouds as though the sky itself had been carefully arranged for the journey home. Ethan Carter stood quietly near one of the panoramic windows, dressed in a freshly issued Human Alliance service uniform that looked almost identical to the one he had worn 12 years earlier. Only the fabric had changed. The weight on his shoulders felt exactly the same. Below, the capital of the Veltraxis Empire stretched across rolling mountains and shimmering lakes, its graceful towers reflecting afternoon sunlight in ribbons of blue and gold. Elevated gardens floated between crystal bridges. Streams curved through parks where children from dozens of worlds played together beneath flowering trees. Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. This was not the civilization he remembered escorting through a desperate battlefield. This was a civilization that had survived long enough to build beauty instead of defenses. The shuttle touched down inside the central palace complex where rows of ceremonial guards stood perfectly still beneath tall white banners embroidered with the royal crest. Military officers from both the Human Alliance and the Veltraxis Empire waited near the landing platform. Yet something immediately felt unusual. There were no reporters, no cheering crowds, no grand celebration. Everything had been arranged with remarkable privacy. A senior palace official stepped forward and bowed respectfully. "Captain Carter, Her Majesty has requested a personal audience before any public announcement is made." Ethan nodded politely. "I appreciate that." The official guided him through broad marble corridors where sunlight poured through towering windows instead of artificial lighting. Every hallway displayed paintings chronicling the Empire's history. Ethan paused more than once after recognizing scenes connected to the convoy attack. One enormous mural showed dozens of ships surrounding a single human cruiser facing a wall of brilliant light. Visitors walked past it in respectful silence. None of them noticed the real man, standing only a few feet away. The deeper they entered the palace, the quieter everything became. The distant sounds of government offices slowly faded until only footsteps echoed across polished stone floors. Finally, the official stopped before two enormous silver doors decorated with intricate carvings of stars, gradually transforming into flowering branches. Her Majesty is waiting. The doors opened soundlessly. Ethan expected a crowded throne room filled with ministers, advisors, and military commanders. Instead, he found a vast chamber almost completely empty. Sunlight streamed through a curved wall of transparent crystal overlooking endless gardens below. At the far end stood a single throne crafted from pale silver alloy, elegant rather than imposing. Upon it sat Queen Lysra Vale. 12 years had changed her with quiet dignity rather than dramatic transformation. Her silver hair flowed neatly over formal royal robes trimmed in deep blue. The crown resting upon her head caught the afternoon light without overwhelming the calm confidence in her expression. She no longer looked like the young princess standing behind reinforced glass during a desperate battle. She looked like someone who had spent years carrying the hopes of countless lives without allowing that responsibility to harden her heart. Ethan walked forward until palace protocol suggested he stop. He offered a respectful military salute instead of kneeling. "Your Majesty." Lysra looked at him for several long seconds without speaking. Her violet eyes searched his face as though comparing memory with reality, afraid that one careless blink might make him disappear again. Ethan waited patiently, believing she was simply observing formal ceremony. He did not realize that she was seeing, for the first time in 12 years, the man she had quietly mourned every single day. Without warning, Lysra rose from the throne. Palace attendants near the entrance looked at one another in visible surprise. Queens did not leave the throne before guests approached. Yet she stepped down from the elevated platform anyway. One measured step, then another. The polished floor reflected the crown as she crossed the distance separating ruler from soldier. Ethan instinctively straightened his posture, uncertain whether he had unknowingly violated some royal custom. She stopped only an arm's length away. The chamber became so silent that he could hear the gentle breeze moving through the open gardens beyond the crystal walls. Then, before anyone could understand what was happening, the Queen of the Velar Empire slowly lowered her head in gratitude before the human captain who still believed he had merely completed another ordinary mission. No one inside the throne hall moved. The palace attendants remained frozen where they stood. The royal guards held their ceremonial staffs without the slightest adjustment. Even the afternoon breeze drifting through the open crystal arches seemed to hesitate before crossing the polished floor. Ethan Carter instinctively took half a step forward. "Your Majesty, please, there is no need for this." His voice carried the same quiet humility that had guided every order he had ever given. Lysra slowly lifted her head, her violet eyes reflecting years that Ethan had never lived. A gentle smile appeared, filled not with triumph, but with relief. "Captain Carter," she said softly, "for 12 years I have rehearsed this moment in my mind. I imagine what I would say if fate ever returned you to us. Yet now that you are standing here, every speech I prepared feels far too small." Ethan lowered his salute. "I only did what any officer should have done." Several advisors standing near the entrance exchanged uncertain glances. They had studied the records their entire careers. They had memorized the convoy incident as one of the defining moments in modern galactic history. Hearing the man himself describe it as nothing more than ordinary duty left them speechless. Lysra turned slightly toward the attendants. "Leave us." The chief steward hesitated. "Your Majesty, protocol recommends." She met his eyes with calm certainty. "Leave us." Within seconds, the enormous chamber became almost completely empty. The heavy silver doors closed with a quiet mechanical whisper, leaving only the queen, the human captain, and sunlight spilling across the marble floor. Ethan looked around awkwardly. "I hope I have not created unnecessary complications." Lysra laughed very softly. It was the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself since seeing him walk through the palace doors. You have always created complications, Captain. The wonderful kind. She walked toward the crystal wall, overlooking the endless gardens below. Ethan joined her a respectful distance away. Together, they watched children running between flowering trees, while fountains cast shimmering rainbows into the afternoon air. It is beautiful, Ethan admitted. It was not always like this, Lysra replied. After the convoy attack, many believed our alliance would collapse under fear. Instead, something unexpected happened. Human worlds and Velar worlds chose to stand closer together. Ethan nodded slowly. I am glad to hear it. She studied him carefully. Do you know what happened after your transmission disappeared? Ethan shook his head. The last thing I remember is the bridge filling with light. Your cruiser absorbed enough of the plasma wave for our shields to recover. We escaped. Our fleet survived. She paused before continuing. Months later, the evidence uncovered from that attack prevented another war from beginning. The peace that followed was built upon decisions made because we were still alive to make them. Ethan remained silent. He found it difficult to connect those enormous consequences to a choice that had felt so simple at the time. You give me far too much credit, he finally said. History is rarely changed by one person. Lysra looked directly at him. No, history is changed by thousands of people. But sometimes one person gives those thousands the chance to keep living. Ethan quietly looked away toward the distant mountains. He remembered every face aboard the Resolute. The navigator who loved old jazz recordings. The engineer who collected baseball cards from Earth. The communications officer who carried a family photograph beside her console. It was never only me, he whispered. My crew made the same choice. Lysra nodded without hesitation. And that is why every name from the Resolute is carved into the Hall of Guardians beside yours. Ethan's expression softened with quiet gratitude. Thank you. She smiled gently. No, Captain. Thank you. Because of all of you, children now grow up hearing music instead of evacuation alarms. They learn history in classrooms instead of living through it. Beyond the crystal wall, the palace bells began ringing across the capital as the evening sun settled behind the distant mountains. And for the first time since waking from 12 lost years, Ethan realized he was no longer standing inside the memory of a war. He was standing inside the future that his crew had quietly chosen to protect. The following morning, the capital awakened beneath clear blue skies. Yet an unusual stillness settled over the Royal Assembly Plaza long before the ceremony began. Representatives from every allied civilization filled the great amphitheater overlooking the palace gardens. Human diplomats stood beside Velar admirals. Scholars shared quiet conversations with engineers, explorers, physicians, and relief workers whose lives had been shaped by the peace forged over the previous 12 years. Ethan Carter had expected a modest meeting with government officials before quietly returning to Earth. Instead, he found himself standing behind a simple curtain near the edge of the enormous stage, wearing the same service uniform that had once disappeared into a wall of brilliant light. A palace attendant approached with visible respect. Captain, Her Majesty requests only one thing. Ethan looked up. What is that? Please do not interrupt her. He smiled faintly. I cannot promise that until I hear what she intends to say. Before the attendant could answer, the ceremonial bells echoed across the plaza. Queen Lysra stepped onto the central platform beneath the royal standard, her silver crown reflecting the morning sunlight without a trace of extravagance. The thousands gathered below rose together in silent respect. She acknowledged them with a graceful nod before allowing the quiet to settle naturally across the assembly. Citizens of the Velar Empire, she began, her calm voice carrying effortlessly through the open air. For many years you have been told that I guided our people through the darkest chapter of our history. You have called me the queen who preserved the empire. She paused, letting the words linger before gently shaking her head. That is not the complete truth. Curious murmurs spread through the audience before fading once more. Lysra continued. 12 years ago I survived because someone I had never met chose to place another life before his own. He did not know my future. He did not know my title would one day matter. He simply believed that protecting another person was the right thing to do. Ethan lowered his eyes, already uncomfortable with where the speech was leading. Many rulers receive credit for victories built upon foundations they did not lay, Lysra said. Today I will correct one such mistake. She turned toward the side entrance of the stage. Captain Ethan Carter, would you please join me? The plaza became astonishingly quiet as Ethan slowly walked into the sunlight. Thousands of faces turned toward him, yet he kept his attention on the Queen instead of the crowd. There was no dramatic music, no triumphant procession, only the sound of measured footsteps crossing polished stone. When he reached the center of the platform, Lysera faced the assembly once more. This man never asked for recognition. He never requested reward. In fact, he still insists he was only doing his duty. A warm ripple of laughter moved gently through the audience. Even Ethan could not suppress a small smile. Lysera continued, her voice growing softer rather than louder. History often remembers the person wearing the crown because crowns are easy to see. It is much harder to remember the ordinary hands that quietly prevented the crown from falling forever. She turned toward Ethan. Captain, every school across our worlds teaches children that courage changes history. Today they deserve to know the face behind that lesson. Without warning, every member of the Royal Guard standing around the plaza lowered their ceremonial staffs simultaneously. Human honor guards mirrored the gesture only a heartbeat later. Admirals, ambassadors, and civic leaders followed until thousands of people stood together in silent respect. No command had been given. No protocol required it. Gratitude had simply spread from one person to another. Ethan looked across the sea of lowered heads and felt something far heavier than any military decoration. He remembered the bridge of the Resolute. He remembered the crew who had remained at their stations without hesitation. Slowly he raised his hand, not toward himself, but toward the clear morning sky. If you wish to honor anyone, he said quietly, honor every soul who stood with me that day. Peace was never built by one person. For several seconds no one spoke. Then, throughout the vast plaza, people began applauding not with excitement, but with the quiet, enduring respect reserved for those whose greatest acts were never performed for recognition at all. As the applause gradually faded into the gentle sounds of the palace gardens, Ethan Carter found himself wishing the ceremony had already ended. Recognition had never been comfortable for him. Throughout his years in uniform, success had always belonged to the team, and failure had always belonged to the captain. That simple belief had shaped every decision he ever made. Queen Lysera seemed to understand without a single word being spoken. She dismissed the formal procession early and invited Ethan to walk with her beyond the public gardens, where ancient stone paths wound through quiet groves overlooking the valley below. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass while birds native to Valor glided silently above crystal ponds reflecting the sky like polished mirrors. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. After everything that had happened, the silence itself felt honest. They eventually stopped beside a modest memorial built beneath a flowering tree whose silver leaves shimmered gently whenever the breeze passed through them. Unlike the grand monuments standing throughout the capital, this one carried no statues of kings, queens, or military victories. A simple wall of polished stone displayed the engraved names of every crew member aboard the Resolute. Ethan slowly stepped closer. His fingertips rested lightly against the cool surface as he quietly read each familiar name. Faces returned with every line. Voices he had not heard in 12 years suddenly felt close enough to answer. The navigator who never began a shift without humming an old jazz tune. The engineer who insisted every machine deserved patience before repair. The communications officer who carried photographs of her family everywhere she went. For several long moments Ethan said nothing. Neither did Lysera. She simply stood beside him, allowing memory to speak where words could not. Finally Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. They made it here before I did. Lysera nodded gently. Every year students visit this place before they graduate. They learn these names before they learn mine. Ethan looked toward her with visible surprise. You arranged that? No, she answered softly. Our teachers did. They believed children should understand that peace is inherited from ordinary people willing to make extraordinary choices. Ethan lowered his eyes again. They would have been embarrassed to hear that. Perhaps, Lysera replied with a warm smile. But they also would have been proud to see children laughing instead of hiding. The palace bells echoed faintly across the distant hills as evening slowly settled over the valley. Lysera reached up and carefully removed the silver crown from her head. For a brief moment, She simply held it between both hands, studying the light dancing across its polished surface. Then she placed it gently upon the memorial wall beneath the engraved names. Ethan looked at her with quiet confusion. "Your Majesty?" She shook her head almost imperceptibly. "For 1 minute today, this belongs here." The crown rested beneath the names of ordinary sailors, engineers, officers, and technicians who had never imagined history would remember them. No photographers witnessed the moment. No official records announced it. Only the fading sunlight reflected across polished silver and engraved stone. After a while, Lysera carefully lifted the crown once more and placed it back upon her head. "A crown is only metal," she said quietly. "Its meaning comes from the people who make tomorrow possible." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I think your people chose well." They began walking back toward the palace as the first evening stars appeared above the mountains. Behind them, the memorial remained untouched, glowing softly beneath the silver leaves, while distant laughter drifted from the city below. Children continued playing in open parks. Families filled evening markets. Travelers crossed peaceful skies once guarded by warships. None of them knew the quiet conversation that had just taken place in the garden. None of them needed to. They were living its answer. Far above the world, countless stars stretched across the darkness exactly as they had 12 years earlier, unchanged and silent. Yet somewhere between those distant lights and the quiet paths below, one simple truth endured. History remembered the queen because she wore the crown. The stars remembered the human because he never needed one.